So I like to ask and answer a question when reviewing games. Who's it for? And after spending 50 hours with Monster Hunter Wilds, the answer to that question is simple. It's for Monster Hunter fans. But maybe you're not a Monster Hunter fan. Maybe you're someone who hasn't played Capcom's Rock'em Sock'em Monster Carver, period. Or maybe you're like me and played Monster Hunter Generations on the 3DS and didn't jive with the awkward controls, thus skipping over the critically acclaimed Monster Hunter World. It is, after all, an action RPG series with very unique gameplay that equates to a high learning curve. While I did fall in love with Monster Hunter Rise on the Switch and eventually went back to play Monster Hunter World, you might still be on the fence as to whether or not you'll bounce off this latest entry. And that's why I ask that question, who's it for, and aim to answer it in this review. If you were to boil Monster Hunter down to its base elements, you'd be left with this. You slay big monsters with your favorite of 14 different weapons. You then carve them up to make better weapons and armor to take on stronger monsters, and then repeat for dozens upon dozens of hours. But of course it's much more complicated than that. All of the weapons are so distinct from one another that they provide entirely different gameplay experiences, and so too do the monsters. The monsters carry with them an inherent memorability, a charm, normally reserved for a Pokemon or the creatures from Dragon Quest. And the 5 sprawling environments are filled with endemic life and resources that aid you on monster hunts, which turns their gorgeous vistas into characters themselves. There's also cooking and fishing and resource harvesting and skills baked into armor sets and gems to slot into equipment for different skills, and sometimes monsters will fight each other, and a weather system, and quite a lot of endgame stuff I can't talk about in this review, and oh yeah, I can't believe I haven't mentioned until now, but you have a cat buddy called a Palico that helps you out. While previous games didn't, Monster Hunter Wilds also leans a bit more into the narrative side of things. As the focus on story in promotional media may have drawn you to Wilds, I want to emphasize that the story here is serviceable. It's a bit like a thematically confused distraction with pretty cutscenes. It runs for about 20 hours and serves as an extended tutorial, upon which more difficult high-rank monsters unlock for endless hours of narrative-light monster slaying afterward. Really, Wilds is 2 games in one, the extended story tutorial and the post-game where you'll grind the same monsters over and over to gather specific rare materials, perhaps while playing co-op with friends. If the latter doesn't sound that appealing, I honestly do not think Monster Hunter Wilds is for you, because again, despite an emphasis on narrative presentation, I came away disappointed with the story, especially because this kid here grated on my nerves. He's the only one in the entire game that sees any character development, but it comes off heavy-handed and gave me a bit of whiplash as he flip-flopped between ideals. There's themes of ecological balance between monsters and nature that are solved simply by killing the monsters, and this kid can't decide whether to save or kill them despite the only option for gameplay being kill them. Capcom often twists the story around to make that seem like the best choice despite everything in the narrative saying otherwise. It's like they carved the narrative up for parts like one of the monsters during development and never made a cool armor set with it. I plan on uploading a full narrative critique once the game fully releases, so maybe subscribe if you want to check that out. I'd also quickly like to mention performance. I'm playing on a solidly mid-range PC with a 3060 Ti at 1440p, maintaining a fairly consistent 60 frames per second on medium settings with DLSS set to balanced. In fights against more cinematic monsters, the resolution can drop dramatically, however. This may or may not bother you, so keep that in mind and maybe check out the Digital Foundry tech review. Anyway, Wilds does away with a lot of the fluff from previous Monster Hunter games. You no longer have to track monsters. This mount, called a secret, will auto-walk you right to them. There's no forced gimmicky modes like the Tower Defense Rampage from Rise either. Instead, it's just you, a handful of bland companions, and more than 20 awesome foes to topple. The monsters unlock at the end of every main story quest, so you can hunt them all you want to collect enough materials to forge a new armor set or a weapon with a distinct look and even more distinct properties tied to them. They've also introduced a handful of new mechanics like flashy offset attacks that counter monsters. More importantly, wounds now form if you hit the same place on a monster repeatedly, allowing you to then consume them for massive damage. Each specific weapon does so differently. Thankfully, you can now bring 2 different weapons with you on each hunt in Wilds, swapping them out as the situation demands. Naturally, the more you play with a specific weapon, the better you'll get. Honestly, Monster Hunter Wilds feels like playing with 2 left hands or right hands at first, as each weapon has many complexities that the game purposely doesn't explain to you, letting you figure it out as you go. Throw in some unusual controls, and that's why I stuck with the well-balanced switch axe for much of the footage you're seeing. It switches between an axe form that builds a meter that unlocks the sword form, which then builds another powerful meter that lets me unleash huge elemental discharges for massive damage, including stabbing a monster in the head and flipping off it like I'm in an anime. As I main the Switch Axe in Rise and World, it was easier for me to relearn it than spending hours getting worked over trying to figure out a new weapon. But with the option to take 2 weapons on hunts, Wilds makes it easier to experiment with others as you go. I did end up maining the bow and eventually dabbled in both the hammer and dual blades. However, that footage is fairly late game and under embargo restrictions. I started off terrible with all 3, but a few hours with the bow in particular and I was peppering my foes with ease, perfect dodging out of the way and firing off massive wyvern piercing shots that ripped right through them. Every weapon I tried was simply awesome to use once I got used to it. Let's take a look at a hunt against this fiery chicken monster called a Cumatrice, so you can see how differently the gameplay looks between the dual blades and the hammer. Well, actually 3 hunts mixed together as I ran it back a couple of times to get more footage. You may have noticed I switched from my purple mustachioed hero to the default heroine to do this. I went ahead and created a new character to emphasize how differently weapons play. After accepting a hunt from Four Eyes over here, me and my kitty pal have a meal. If you're hungry, your maximum health and stamina will decrease. Furthermore, different ingredients provide different buffs, like increased attack and the ability to survive a fatal blow. A lot of what you see spread out across the 5 varied maps serve as resources to gather for food and other consumables. Here, the secret I'm riding is auto-walking me right to where I need to go. Some might find this dilutes the exploration aspects of Monster Hunter, but I found it helpful for getting me right into the action rather than fiddling with a map. Anyway, a hunt against a Cumatrice takes about 10 minutes to complete, but more skilled hunters can bring that time down significantly. The many progression systems like armor, weapons, personal skill, and monster knowledge combine to create some truly epic fights, even against a fire chicken that's relatively weak by Monster Hunter standards. In fact, it's the second monster you'll face in the game. You can see here with the dual blades I was whiffing my attacks and not in sync with its demon mode and archdemon mode at the core of the weapon's gameplay, which you must balance with stamina, the yellow gauge at the top, and with the small orange meter below it. My Palico buddy had to come in and rescue me with heals a couple of times. As the dual blades are quite different from the switch axe and bow I normally play, it took me a few minutes to get the hang of it, and then I was dicing up this chicken like I was preparing it for a KFC's deep fryer. When I created a wound by attacking a certain area repeatedly, I could simply aim and strike there with a single press of the right bumper to pull off this slick breakdancing move unique to the dual blades. The hammer, on the other hand, also took me a moment to get the hang of, but it's a much more straightforward weapon as it doesn't require managing power meters. It's all about positioning and patience to get heavy charged up hits in. As you might have noticed, the dual blades were doing around 10 damage with each fast strike, but the hammer tenderizes this chicken for over 100 damage in massive single hits. And much like with the dual blades, the hammer has a wound-consuming special attack that's triggered with the right bumper and, as you'd expect, is also super satisfying. In fact, I'd say every single weapon in Monster Hunter Wilds feels incredibly satisfying and kinetic once you learn how to use it. Until you do, however, it can be frustrating as monsters bat you around the map. As someone who has put 50 hours into Wilds, the first Cumatrice I defeated for this video took 7 minutes and 46 seconds with only the dual blades. The second, where I was also relearning the hammer, and I accidentally called in NPC help, took me 6 minutes and 17 seconds. And finally, after I got comfortable with both weapons, I served up some fried chicken in just about 6 minutes without really using any healing items. I could probably get that number down to near 5 minutes, especially if I learned how to use the offset attacks with both weapons, mastered the demon modes with the blades, and weaved in the hammer's charging sidestep move. Anyway, after all that, I had more than enough Cumatrice materials to craft some very slick armor with good fire and flinch resistance. And if I were to continue playing this character, I'd be off to fight much more difficult monsters, some of them screen-fillingly massive, for another 50 to 100 hours across maps that shift between 3 different states, bringing with it different monsters, environmental conditions, and most importantly, a ton of variety. I highlight this weapon variety because, even after 50 hours, not only do I want to continue improving with the switch axe, bow, dual blades, and hammer, but I also want to try out incredibly difficult weapons like the insect glaive and something more defense-focused like the sword and shield. Trying out these weapons could give me another dozen hours of gameplay each, not to mention grinding the endgame economy to put together overpowered builds. It's all incredibly rewarding and what makes Monster Hunter special, if you can surmount that initial learning curve. So that brings us full circle to my original question: who is Monster Hunter Wilds for? Monster Hunter Wilds is for Monster Hunter fans, obviously. It's also for people who've bounced off the series previously like me and want to give it another shot. Some of the more tedious mechanics from previous games have been cut, making it easier to climb over that initial learning curve. Furthermore, the wound system helps you feel like a badass regardless of skill level, and rewards you further when you do get good. If you haven't played Monster Hunter before, consider your patience level for learning new mechanics and steadily progressing through a grind-heavy endgame before picking it up. It isn't the type of game you can just pick up and play leisurely. You have to make an effort to get the hang of it. Wilds is not for those looking for an action RPG to run through the main story and move on from. First, the story, while serviceable, is ultimately disappointing. But more importantly, all its systems come together when you unlock the high rank monsters at around the 20-hour mark. So if you're adverse to the time investment required to get good at monster hunting, Wilds probably isn't for you. Still, if I were to slap a review score on Monster Hunter Wilds, I'd probably give it like an 8 out of 10. Until the previous entry, Monster Hunter Rise, I wasn't a fan of the series, but I managed to hurdle over the unique mechanics and fell in love. Now, Monster Hunter games are explicitly for someone like me. I see myself playing Wilds for another 50 hours minimum, despite toppling every single monster more than once already. I'll definitely play co-op with friends after the global launch and pick up every piece of upcoming DLC content. And once I've consumed all that, I'll join the ranks of monster hunters eagerly awaiting Monster Hunter Universe or whatever comes next in like 2029. Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Lowell and I'm a freelance game critic and guides writer, and you may have read my words on websites like Nintendo Life and PCGamesN. I often get games a bit early and like to make video reviews and other opinion pieces on them. So if you like what you just watched, maybe like and subscribe so I'm motivated to keep on doing it. Thanks, bye.